Imagine, imagine you're walking into this highly secure, ultra-modern bank, like the kind that holds millions in physical
No,
assets.
right, like a real fortress.
Exactly. And you see the vault door, right? It's like 3 feet of solid steel. You see the biometric scanners on the walls. You see the armed guards doing their coordinated patrols.
Yeah, it creates this really powerful psychological comfort.
Totally. If you have money in that bank, you're feeling pretty good about it. You feel safe because, the visual language of security is just everywhere.
Right, you're looking at a fortress, and you just assume the internal protocols match the external hardware.
Yeah. But then you walk up to the main administrative desk, the desk where the bank manager sits, right? The exact person who can override the vault, change the alarm codes, and access literally every safety deposit box.
The central point of failure.
Right. And sitting right there, completely exposed on their desk, is a sticky note. And it has their master password written in plain ink. And there's no secondary check at all. Yeah. Any person walking off the street could just sit down, type in that password, and completely own the bank.
Which, that instantly renders the steel vault and the armed guards completely irrelevant.
Exactly.
The perimeter is just a theatrical illusion if the administrative core is practically wide open.
And that feeling, right, that massive mind-boggling disconnect between the expectation of top-tier security and the reality of just staggering human negligence, that is exactly what we are diving into today.
It's a heavy topic.
It really is. We are looking at a massive stack of source material today for you. We've got forensic intelligence reports, threat intelligence flashes, profiles of digital dissidents, and some really heavy excerpts from a book called Log Into Hell.
And the documentation we have, it paints a very clear, very unsettling picture of the current state of digital infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's honestly a terrifying collection of data.
It really is. And our mission for you today is to pull all these disparate pieces together to unpack a high-stakes modern digital conflict.
Because it's not just theory anymore.
Right. We are going to look closely at the April 2026 BEPRIME data breach. We want to use this specific incident as our definitive case study to understand this massive, invisible war that is happening right now under the surface of the internet.
The war between transparency and what the sources call secretism.
Yes. The war between corporate secretism, which is this desperate need for institutions to hide their failures, and the push for radical digital transparency.
And I think it's important to note right off the bat, this extends far beyond just a single company in Mexico.
Oh, absolutely.
The frameworks we are analyzing today dictate the digital sovereignty and personal safety of every single person listening.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the irony of this specific breach is just, it's almost hard to believe. We are going to navigate the timeline of this conflict, but to really understand the gravity of what happened, I need you to approach this almost like an expert witness taking the stand in a courtroom.
I can do that.
I don't want to just talk about computer glitches, I want you to forensically analyze this as a systemic failure of institutional accountability. So if we view this digital landscape as a crime scene, what exactly are we looking at here?
Well, if I'm taking the stand to evaluate this evidence, my initial assessment is that we are looking at a profound structural decay in how organizations handle the data they are entrusted with.
Structural decay.
Yeah. The technical failures, they're just symptoms. The real disease here is administrative.
Let's lay out the raw facts from the forensic reports to get started. So, April 2026, Monterrey, Mexico. A cybersecurity firm named BEPRIME suffers a massive data breach.
A cybersecurity firm, right?
Yeah, a firm selling security. And the sources emphasize a very specific number here. 53 gigabytes of data was leaked. But I want to pause here because I think people hear gigabytes and they think of, a couple of 4K movies or a really big video game install. What does 53 gigabytes of purely administrative and text-based data actually look like?
That is a really crucial distinction to make because, video files and high-resolution images, they eat up gigabytes very quickly.
Right, they're huge files.
Exactly. But text, configuration files, system logs, administrative credentials, and client records, those are measured in kilobytes. A single gigabyte can hold roughly tens of thousands of pages of text.
So 53 gigabytes is...
It is an absolute mountain of intelligence.
Wow.
It is the structural blueprint of their entire operation, and more importantly, the operations of their clients. We are talking about millions of lines of highly sensitive operational data.
So it's not just a few embarrassing internal memos.
No, not at all. It is the entire architectural map of how this cybersecurity firm functioned and how it supposedly defended its clients.
And here is the irony that just completely blows my mind. BEPRIME is a cybersecurity firm. Their entire business model is selling digital protection to major corporate clients. And how did their fortress get breached? Because their administrative accounts lacked two-factor authentication.
Yeah, no 2FA on admin accounts. In 2026.
I am struggling to even process that. Like, I have 2FA on my fantasy football account. Explain to the listener what it means to not have 2FA in this context.
Two-factor authentication it's the absolute baseline of digital hygiene. It operates on a really simple premise. Gaining access requires something you know, like a password, and something you have.
Like your phone.
Right, like a physical security key, an authenticator app on your phone, or even an SMS code.
So the password is the sticky note from our bank analogy earlier.
Exactly. Passwords get leaked all the time.
Yeah.
They get reused. They get guessed. If you only rely on a password, a single mistake compromises the entire system. 2FA is the safety net.
Because even if they get the password, they don't have the phone.
Right. Even if a threat actor gets your password, they can't log in because they don't have your physical phone to get that second code. For an everyday user, missing 2FA is risky. But for an administrator account...
An account that has the keys to the kingdom.
Exactly. For that account to lack 2FA is not just a minor oversight. As an expert evaluating this forensic reality, I classify it as gross negligence.
Is hiring the elite security team and leaving the master key under the welcome mat?
It's actually worse. It's leaving the master key under the mat of the security company's own headquarters.
God. Let's look at what was actually inside that 53-gigabyte mountain of text, because the fallout is, honestly, terrifying.
It really is.
The leak exposed live surveillance camera feeds. It exposed highly sensitive internal communications. But the sources keep highlighting one specific exposure over and over. Cisco Meraki admin panels. I really want to dig into this. What is a Meraki panel, and why is an attacker getting access to it such a nightmare scenario?
Right. So Meraki is a cloud-managed networking solution. Imagine a traditional corporate network. Routers, switches, firewalls, all physical boxes sitting in a cold server room somewhere.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Meraki takes the control interface for all that physical hardware and puts it in the cloud. It allows an IT administrator to manage a physical network in Mexico City from a laptop in Tokyo.
Oh, wow. So it's like the air traffic control tower for the entire corporate network.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
If you have administrative access to that Meraki panel, you effectively own the physical network it controls. You don't just see the traffic, you control the routing.
So if I'm the threat actor and I've bypassed BPrime's non-existent 2FA and I've gotten into their client's Meraki panels, what can I actually do? Walk me through the nuts and bolts of that pivot.
Okay, so if I have that access, the first thing I do is alter the firewall rules. I can silently open a port to allow malicious traffic to flow into the client's internal network without triggering any alarms whatsoever.
You just open the back door.
Yeah, and then I can reroute sensitive data streams to my own external servers. I can push malicious firmware updates directly to their physical routers. I can even create VPN tunnels, virtual private networks, that connect my laptop directly to their highly secure internal servers.
Bypassing everything.
Bypassing all their perimeter defenses. Because the Meraki panel is literally telling the network, hey, trust this connection. The administrator authorized it.
So you aren't just breaking down the front door, you're using the central control system to unlock all the doors from the inside, and you're basically turning off the security cameras while you do it.
Which exposes BPrime's major clients to immediate catastrophic risk. And this brings us to a really critical dynamic outlined in the intelligence reports, which is the concept of the security gap.
Right, let's focus on that, the security gap. How do the sources actually define it?
The security gap is defined as the specific window of time between a vulnerability being actively exploited by a threat actor and the defense or public awareness of that exploit being mounted.
Okay, so the clock starts the literal moment the hacker gets past the missing 2FA.
Yes. The moment BPrime's data is breached, the security gap opens. And every single second that gap remains open, the threat actors have uncontested access.
Just wandering around in the dark.
Exactly. They are quietly weaponizing those Meraki panels, they are observing those live camera feeds to understand physical security routines, and they are pivoting deep into the networks of BPrime's clients.
The longer the gap, the more devastating the blast radius.
The blast radius grows exponentially.
Yeah.
If a gap is closed in an hour, you might just have to reset some passwords. If a gap is open for weeks or months,
Game over.
pretty much. The threat actors are exfiltrating intellectual property, planting ransomware that will detonate later, and establishing persistent backdoors that are incredibly difficult to eradicate.
So the breach happens, the security gap rips open, and 53 gigabytes of catastrophic risk is just out in the wild. But as I'm reading through these forensic reports, the breach itself, as humiliating as it is for a firm selling cybersecurity, wasn't even the most shocking part to me.
No, it wasn't.
It was the company's immediate reaction.
The administrative reaction is where this case study transitions from a story of technical failure into a story of structural malice.
Because instead of practicing what they preach to their own clients, instead of, raising the alarm, being transparent, warning those clients to check their Meraki panels and trying to slam that security gap shut, BEPRIME launched a hostile cover-up.
They absolutely did.
They went on the offensive, but not against the hackers.
No, they attacked the messengers.
They completely weaponized the legal system. According to the reports, BEPRIME issued hostile legal threats against journalists. They accused independent security researchers of defamation. They threatened immediate lawsuits with one singular goal: to completely silence any public coverage of the 53-gigabyte leak.
They wanted to bury the forensic reality under a mountain of cease and desist letters.
But let me push back on this for a second, because if I play devil's advocate and I look at this from the perspective of BEPRIME's corporate lawyers, isn't that kind of their job?
How do you mean?
Like, if someone on the internet starts claiming they have your company's data, shouldn't a lawyer's first instinct be to issue a cease and desist to stop the bleeding while they figure out if the claims are even real? How do they know the researcher isn't just making it up?
It's a fair question, but it fundamentally misunderstands the difference between an investigation and a suppression campaign. In cybersecurity, when a massive data leak is reported by independent researchers, the standard ethical protocol is to initiate an incident response process.
You verify the data.
You verify the data. You communicate securely with the researcher.
Yeah.
You look at the evidence.
Right, you actually look at the evidence instead of just suing them.
Exactly.
Oh.
What BEPRIME did was skip the investigation phase entirely and default immediately to aggressive legal intimidation. They weren't trying to figure out if the data was real. They were trying to make it illegal to talk about the data.
Wow.
And the reason I call this structural malice is because this reaction is not an anomaly. It is a textbook execution of what the frameworks in our source material called the protocol of silence.
The protocol of silence. The sources spend a significant amount of time breaking this down. Let's really get into the weeds here. What is the protocol of silence mechanically?
Mechanically, it is a structural defense mechanism utilized by institutions globally. The protocol of silence is this unwritten doctrine where an institution decides that the preservation of its administrative reputation, its stock price, and the careers of its directors is vastly more important than the actual protection of client or citizen data.
So it's an active, conscious choice to prioritize PR over security.
It's a calculated risk assessment where they decide the client is expendable. BEPRIME wasn't reacting with blind panic. They were executing a very specific strategy. And the intelligence reports break this protocol down into the 4 pillars of secretism.
Okay, let's apply these pillars directly to what BEPRIME is doing so the listener can see the actual machinery at work.
The 4 pillars are narrative minimization, delayed disclosure, legal paralysis, and information siloing. By firing off aggressive legal threats to journalists, BEPRIME was attempting to force legal paralysis.
Meaning, if a journalist receives a threat of a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit, their editor is probably just going to kill the story.
Exactly. The legal department of a news organization will often balk at the cost of defending a cyber espionage story. So the story dies. And if no one can legally write about the breach, the public regulatory bodies remain oblivious, and the clients remain completely unaware that their Meraki panels are compromised.
Which feeds perfectly into the next pillar. By keeping the clients in the dark through legal threats, they are forcing delayed disclosure.
Yes.
They are trying to buy themselves time to quietly patch the missing 2FA and clean up the mess internally, all while their clients are actively bleeding data to whoever bought that 53-gigabyte dump.
And that is the core betrayal right there. They are artificially extending that security gap we talked about earlier. They're giving the threat actors weeks of uncontested access to their clients' networks, just so BEPRIME can avoid the embarrassment of admitting they lacked basic authentication protocols.
It's just infuriating. But the sources provide a really interesting global context for this behavior. This isn't just one rogue company in Mexico acting badly. The sources point to something called the Global Secretism Index.
The Global Secretism Index is a fascinating metric. It basically ranks countries and major institutions on their propensity to actively hide cybersecurity failures from their citizens. It demonstrates how widespread this pathology is at the state level.
Let's look at some examples from the index to see how this plays out globally.
Okay, well, the index cites the Uruguayan state, assigning it a massive secretism score of 9.7 out of 10.
9.7. That means transparency is practically non-existent.
It means the default state response to a breach is denial. The sources also highlight a very prominent case study from Argentina, the March 2026 Cronus Mafia breach.
Oh, I remember reading about the Cronus Mafia attack in the notes. That was an incredibly severe incident. Over 8 million citizen records were exposed from 28 different state agencies. We are talking about the PMI health databases, the RENAPR national ID system. Highly sensitive, unchangeable citizen data.
And how did the Argentine executive branch respond when faced with 8 million compromised records? They employed what the frameworks call institutional muteness.
Total, absolute silence.
They completely ignored the ransom countdown. When the data was inevitably published, they engaged in narrative minimization. They dismissed the massive exposure as just old data or repackaged leaks. They refused to issue actionable warnings to the public.
So what BEPRIME attempted to do with their legal threats is essentially a localized corporate version of this exact same state-level secretism. They were trying to enforce corporate muteness.
They were following the exact same playbook. And usually it works.
That's the depressing part. Usually, a corporation with deep pockets can easily bully an independent journalist or a solo security researcher into submission. They just get trapped in the loop of doom, as the sources call it.
Yeah, let's clarify the loop of doom, because it's sinister. It's a corporate legal strategy designed entirely for attrition. You don't actually need to win a case in court. You just need to keep your opponent stuck in infinite legal correspondence.
You just bury them.
You bury them in procedural paper, you demand endless discovery, and you drain their financial resources paying lawyers until they simply give up and go away.
It's a war of financial exhaustion. But here is where the entire narrative pivots in a really satisfying way, because BEPRIME made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed they were dealing with someone who would get caught in that loop of doom.
They did.
They picked a fight with the wrong ecosystem. Specifically, they drew the attention of a highly resilient digital rights advocate named Alberto Hill.
This is the entry point of the digital dissident.
Who is Alberto Hill? Because the profile provided in the sources paints a very compelling, very specific picture. He is a Uruguayan threat intelligence analyst. He's an ethical hacker. And he operates incredibly effectively in the public square, heavily utilizing X, formerly Twitter, and hosting these massive live audio spaces. The intelligence frameworks refer to him using a specific archetype, the digital knight.
It's a crucial archetype to understand in modern digital conflicts.
Yeah.
Because when the state or the corporation fundamentally fails the social contract of transparency, the digital dissident emerges out of pure necessity.
Right.
Hill doesn't step into this situation as a traditional, quiet corporate consultant offering to help for a fee. He steps in as an independent, disruptive force deploying an asymmetric strategy.
I want to spend some time on this term, asymmetric strategy. Because in a traditional symmetric fight, BEPRIME wins every time, right? They have all the money, an entire legal department, institutional power. Alberto is one guy sitting at a computer in Montevideo. It's David and Goliath. So how does David actually fight back in a digital context? What does asymmetry look like here?
Asymmetric warfare, in this digital rights context, means completely bypassing the traditional corporate battlegrounds. You refuse to enter the loop of doom.
You don't play their game.
Exactly. You don't try to fight their corporate lawyers with your own lawyers because you will lose the war of attrition. Instead, you use radical transparency, high-level forensic intellect, and highly targeted international pressure to overwhelm their automated defenses.
You flip the board.
You make the truth so incredibly visible and so legally perilous on a global scale that their domestic legal bullying becomes a liability rather than a shield.
The sources detail an incredibly precise, multi-pronged counteroffensive that Alberto launched against BEPRIME. I want to break down the exact methods he used to force this company into compliance because it really is a masterclass in applying systemic pressure.
It's brilliant.
Let's go step by step. Step one of his strategy, the ultimatum.
The ultimatum was the opening move, and it set the tone immediately. Hill published a public open letter directed squarely at BEPRIME. He didn't send a polite, private email to their support desk. He made it public.
He put it out there for everyone to see.
And he demanded that they officially notify all affected clients within 48 hours and remediate the 2FA vulnerability immediately.
He put a ticking clock on the public stage. But why 48 hours? Why not just say, fix it immediately?
Because a specific time boundary forces a crisis response. It removes the corporation's ability to leisurely debate their PR strategy. It signals that if the deadline passes, the escalation will be severe and out of their control.
But an open letter is ultimately just words on a screen, right? A corporate lawyer can ignore a letter. How did he back it up? And that brings us to step 2, forensic truth-telling.
This is where Hill's specific technical skill set became his primary weapon. He didn't just tweet, "Hey, BEPRIME was hacked." That's easy for a PR team to deny as a rumor. Instead, Hill used his platform, specifically his highly attended live X spaces, to provide real-time forensic analysis of the breach.
I really want to understand the mechanics of this. How do you do forensic analysis in a live audio space? That sounds complicated.
It's a multimedia approach. While speaking to an audience of hundreds of cybersecurity professionals, journalists, and interested public, he would utilize the platform's features, pinning screenshots of configuration files, dropping paste-to-bin links to sanitized log excerpts, and meticulously explaining what the audience was looking at. He was parsing the leaked data live.
Oh, wow. So he was basically reading the DNA of the crime scene out loud for the jury.
Precisely. He would point out the structural formatting of a Meraki admin panel export and demonstrate irrefutably that the data was authentic. By doing this live forensic validation, he completely neutralized BEPRIME's ability to use the first pillar of secretism, narrative minimization.
Right, because they couldn't issue a press release calling it a minor unverified glitch when a recognized expert was publicly dissecting their exposed admin logs and showing an audience exactly where the 2FA protocols were missing.
The forensic reality became undeniable.
Exactly. He stripped away their ability to control the narrative by flooding the zone with verifiable technical truth.
Which is exactly what asymmetric warfare looks like.
Okay, so now BEPRIME is exposed technically. The data is proven real, but they still have their lawyers. They could still trying to crush him personally with a massive lawsuit for distributing or analyzing the data. Which brings us to step 3, which I think is frankly brilliant, the tricontinental pincer.
This is the international escalation phase, and it is the absolute core of his asymmetric strategy. Hill knew he couldn't face a corporate legal team in a one-on-one fight in a Mexican court. So he didn't fight them alone. He systematically tagged and engaged heavy-hitting international human rights and digital advocacy organizations.
The sources list them explicitly. We are talking about the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF Reporters Without Borders, Amnesty International, and Access Now.
He built an institutional human rights shield around himself by publicly tying the BEPRIME breach and their subsequent legal threats against journalists to global issues of press freedom and digital human rights. He shifted the battleground.
So if BEPRIME sues him now, they aren't just suing a lone hacker in Uruguay.
No. They are picking a fight with Amnesty International. They are inviting the legal scrutiny of the EFF. Suing one independent researcher is easy, and it happens quietly. Suing a researcher backed by a tricontinental coalition of human rights watchdogs.
That's a nightmare.
It's a catastrophic public relations nightmare. It makes the legal strategy incredibly toxic for the corporation.
He made himself too expensive reputationally to attack, but he didn't stop at PR and human rights. Step 4 is where he hit them directly in their financial and operational center, regulatory weaponization.
And this raises a fascinating question about jurisdiction in the modern digital age. Where does a company's liability end? Hill leveraged a very specific piece of his own background, his dual citizenship. Because Hill holds Italian citizenship, he is legally protected by the GDPR.
The General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the GDPR because it does not mess around. How does an Italian citizen use a European law against a company sitting in Monterrey, Mexico?
The GDPR has a principle of extraterritoriality. It states that if a company anywhere in the world processes the data of an EU citizen, or if a breach compromises the data of an EU citizen, that company is subject to European data protection laws.
So the physical location of the company doesn't matter at all. It's a nationality of the data subject that triggers the law.
Exactly. And the sources refer to the Latvian GDPR model as a framework of mandated transparency. Under the GDPR, an organization has a strict 72-hour window to report a data breach to the relevant supervisory authority. And the financial penalties for failing to protect data or failing to report a breach are massive.
Like how massive?
We are talking about fines up to 4% of a company's total global annual revenue.
Wow, that's not a slap on the wrist. That's a structural blow to the company.
By filing formal complaints under European data protection laws, Hill weaponized international regulations. He legally outflanked their domestic Mexican lawyers by introducing the very real threat of European regulatory fines.
That is just so smart. And finally, step 5, relentless media pressure. He didn't just do this once and walk away. He kept the narrative alive. Constant podcast interviews, daily updates, ongoing community engagement on X. He refused to let the fast-paced news cycle move on to the next distraction.
In the frameworks, this is referred to as maintaining the psychological CERT function.
Psychological cert.
Yeah, a CERT usually stands for Computer Emergency Response Team. But Hill was acting as an emotional and technical anchor for the community. He was ensuring the truth stayed in the spotlight, constantly reminding the public and the clients that the security gap was still an issue.
So let's review the board here. We have the 48-hour ultimatum, the forensic truth-telling proving the leak, the tricontinental pincer of NGOs providing a shield, regulatory weaponization through the GDPR, and relentless media. What was the final result of this 5-step asymmetric strategy?
As an expert witness observing this timeline, the conclusion is absolute. BEPRIME's legal and PR strategy collapsed entirely.
They caved.
The asymmetric warfare was an overwhelming success. The company went completely silent. They quietly dropped the legal threats against the journalists and researchers. Alberto Hill decisively won the narrative war.
It's an incredible tactical victory, but I want to pause here and ask you, what does this actually mean for the listener? Why is this one specific victory against one company in Mexico so important to the person listening right now?
It is critically important because it perfectly illustrates the power and the absolute necessity of radical transparency. Radical transparency is the only effective, proven countermeasure to the protocol of silence.
How do you define radical transparency in this context?
It means making the truth of a breach so public, so technically undeniable, and so legally perilous on an international scale that the institution is forced to abandon secretism. Hill leveled the playing field. He proved that massive entities that rely on opacity and legal bullying can be defeated if you expose their mechanisms of control and shine a light directly on their negligence.
It gives the power back to the user, but it makes you wonder, what happens when there isn't an Alberto Hill around? What happens when a digital knight doesn't step in?
It's a dark thought.
Let's zoom out and look at the macro level here, because if companies or governments do successfully use their legal threats to silence researchers, the consequences seem severe. Why is this battle over transparency so critically important to global infrastructure?
This is where we have to look deeply at the systemic risk of silencing. If we return to the idea of the digital landscape as a crime scene, silencing a security researcher who finds a flaw isn't just an abstract free speech issue. It is a direct, tangible threat to national and global security.
I need you to connect those dots for me. How does a corporate lawyer sending a cease and desist in Mexico threaten global security?
It comes down to the fourth pillar of secretism, information siloing. When a company like BEPRIME or a government agency successfully hides a breach and suppresses the researchers, they aren't just hiding their embarrassment. They are actively suppressing what the intelligence community calls indicators of compromise, or IOCs.
Let's deep dive into IOCs. What exactly is an indicator of compromise?
IOCs are the forensic fingerprints of a cyber attack. It is the highly specific data that details how the attack happened. What specific exploit vector did the hackers use? What IP addresses did the malicious traffic originate from? Did they bypass a specific brand of endpoint detection and response EDR software? Did they exploit a vulnerability in an unpatched legacy protocol?
So it's the method of the crime.
Yes. The sources specifically mentioned the RC4 encryption algorithm as an example. RC4 is a legacy protocol. It's a stream cipher that was designed decades ago. It is deeply vulnerable to bit-flipping attacks and key reuse vulnerabilities. Microsoft didn't officially deprecate it across all their services until 2025, after it had been in use for 26 years.
Wait, if it's broken, why would anyone still use it?
Backwards compatibility. Large institutions often prioritize keeping old systems running over upgrading to secure protocols, because upgrading is expensive and breaks legacy software.
Ah, right. It costs money.
Exactly. So if an attacker successfully uses a known RC4 vulnerability to break into a network, that knowledge that this specific legacy protocol is currently being actively targeted by a specific threat group is a critical piece of intelligence. That is an IOC.
Okay, I see where this is going. If a company gets hacked through an RC4 vulnerability and they use their lawyers to cover it up and silence the researcher who found it, they aren't warning anyone else in the industry that this specific door is being actively kicked in.
Exactly. This is the systemic danger of information siloing. The corporation or the state refuses to share those specific IOCs horizontally across the industry. They don't tell the national certs. They don't tell other cybersecurity firms. What is the second-order consequence of that silence?
The threat actor gets a free pass.
They get an uncontested learning curve. They realize, hey, this RC4 trick we developed works perfectly, and nobody is talking about it. The defenses aren't adapting. So they take that exact same exploit, that exact same EDR bypass technique, and they weaponize it against the next agency, the next bank, the next hospital.
Because the first victim stayed silent to protect their own PR, they left the back door wide open for literally every other institution in the world.
Institutional secretism transforms a localized technical failure into a systemic, cascading crisis. By siloing the information, they artificially expand the security gap globally.
They're essentially trading their own public defensibility for the actual safety of everyone else.
That is exactly what happens. And this leads to what the sources refer to as a bankruptcy of public trust.
And this is where it hits the listener directly. This is the real-world consequence for the person listening right now. When researchers are silenced and information siloing expands that security gap globally, citizens and everyday clients are denied the basic intelligence they desperately need to protect their own digital identities.
If BEPRIME successfully hides the fact that their clients' Meraki panels and data streams are compromised, those clients don't know they need to sever those VPN connections. They don't know they need to forcefully rotate all their administrative credentials.
And the regular people.
The individual citizens whose data might be caught up in those streams don't know they need to monitor their credit or watch out for targeted scams.
By the time the breach is finally acknowledged, if it ever is, maybe months or years later, the window for effective defense has completely closed.
The institutional silence leads directly to massive spikes in identity theft, financial fraud, and highly targeted spear phishing campaigns against the public. The organization manages to save face in the short term, but the citizen pays the very real, very financial price.
It's incredibly sobering when you lay out the mechanics of it like that. It makes you realize the sheer magnitude of the risk Alberto Hill took by going after BEPRIME. He stepped right into the crosshairs of their legal team, risking his own financial ruin and personal freedom just to force that transparency.
He deliberately made himself a target to break the protocol of silence.
And to truly understand why a single guy in Montevideo would willingly paint a target on his back to fight a Mexican corporation, we have to look at his backstory. Because you don't just wake up one morning and decide to become a digital knight. It requires a specific crucible.
It does. And Hill's personal history is the bedrock of his entire philosophy regarding transparency. His asymmetric strategy wasn't learned by reading case studies in a corporate boardroom. It was forged in a deeply traumatic, life-altering collision with institutional incompetence.
Let's look at that origin story because it is wild. The sources detail a timeline from 2014 to 2017 that fundamentally altered his life and, frankly, the cybersecurity landscape in Latin America. The frameworks call this a story of post-traumatic growth. Let's go back to 2014. Alberto is just trying to do a completely mundane task. He's helping his girlfriend book a medical appointment online through a Uruguayan medical provider's portal.
An everyday interaction. But because Hill possesses the mindset of a forensic analyst, he doesn't just look at the web interface. He observes how the application handles data. And he notices something deeply alarming about the underlying structure of the medical provider's website.
The sources are incredibly specific about what he found. He discovers a massive vulnerability. We are talking about the most basic failure imaginable, default administrative credentials. The username was literally admin, and the password was admin.
Returning to our earlier analogy of the bank vault, this isn't even leaving the key under the mat. This is leaving the front doors propped wide open, putting up a neon sign pointing to the vault, and leaving the vault door unlocked. It is a catastrophic failure of basic configuration.
And it gets so much worse. Once he is inside the system, he realizes the site is vulnerable to something called URL manipulation. Explain that concept simply.
It's often referred to as an insecure direct object reference, or IGO. It means that the application doesn't verify if you have permission to view a specific piece of data. So if your patient record is located at a web address that ends in patient equals wall 334, you can simply change the number in the address bar to patient equals 1235. And the system will gladly show you the next person's medical file.
Because there's no secondary check saying, wait, is this guy actually patient 12325?
Exactly. Using this simple manipulation, Hill realizes he has unfettered access to roughly 200,000 patient records. And this isn't just a list of names and emails. This database includes highly sensitive protected health information, including the HIV statuses of patients.
Oh my God. It is a devastating exposure of privacy. Now, in a functioning, mature digital ecosystem, a researcher finding this kind of flaw is treated as a crucial asset. They are the canary in the coal mine. And Hill followed all the established ethical protocols. He engaged in responsible disclosure. He didn't post the data online. He didn't ask the hospital for a ransom. He reported the vulnerability directly to the Uruguayan National Computer Emergency Response Team.
He provided the state with the exact intelligence they needed to close a massive security gap before a malicious actor found it. He did exactly what a responsible citizen should do.
But let's fast forward to 2017. A separate, actual malicious threat actor attempts to extort this exact same medical provider for Bitcoin, threatening to release their patient records. The medical provider panics and calls the police. And instead of launching a sophisticated investigation to find the actual extortionist, what does the state do?
This is where we see the horrific manifestation of what the intelligence reports call a kinetic attack on a security researcher.
A kinetic attack, meaning physical real-world force applied to a digital problem.
Precisely. The state authorities, lacking the basic technical literacy required to properly investigate a complex cybercrime, simply looked at the historical logs of the medical provider. They saw that Hill had responsibly reported a flaw in that same system years earlier, and they applied a devastatingly flawed logic. He knew about the system, therefore he must be the hacker. They weaponized his own responsible disclosure against him.
The details of this police investigation, as outlined in the excerpts from Login to Hell, are just mind-boggling. I want you to analyze this as an expert witness evaluating digital forensics. Give me your professional assessment of the collection methods used by the authorities in this 2017 raid on his home.
My assessment is that it was a profound failure of fundamental investigative protocols. It was a display of systemic, almost aggressive incompetence. The golden rule of digital evidence collection is preservation. You isolate the devices, you create exact digital clones, and you perform your analysis on the clones. You never, ever alter the original state of the devices. According to the text, the police were actively turning on powered-off cell phones during the raid, completely contaminating the memory states and the evidence. They failed to establish or preserve any reliable digital chain of custody.
And what they actually confiscated as evidence of hacking, I mean, it sounds like a joke, but it destroyed a man's life.
They seized a USB killer device.
What actually is a USB killer?
It's essentially a novelty tool or a hardware testing device. When you plug it into a USB port, it rapidly draws power from the port to charge internal capacitors, and then discharges a high-voltage surge around 200 volts back into the data lines. It physically fries the motherboard of the computer. It is an instrument of physical destruction, not a tool for complex network infiltration or data exfiltration. But the police presented it as high-tech hacking equipment.
Because it looks like a thumb drive, they assumed it was used to steal data. That is wild. And that wasn't all. They also confiscated Bitcoin stickers and cryptocurrency keychains.
They operated on the assumption that mere physical association with cryptocurrency memorabilia equated to criminal extortion. They fundamentally lacked the technical comprehension to distinguish between the standard toolkit of a security researcher and actual malicious activity.
The result of this technological illiteracy was devastating. Alberto was dragged into this nightmare. He claims he was extorted by the authorities into signing a false confession, simply to protect his loved ones from being continuously harassed by the police. Because of this, he became the first person in the history of Uruguay to be imprisoned for a computer-related crime. He served 8 months in a maximum security prison.
And this tragedy raises the most critical point regarding national security that we will discuss today. Prosecuting an ethical hacker for engaging in responsible disclosure creates a massive, industry-wide chilling effect.
Explain the mechanics of a chilling effect in cybersecurity.
It's a behavioral shift based on fear. When other researchers and ethical hackers watch what happened to Hill when they see a man sent to a maximum security prison for trying to help, they make a very rational calculation. They decide to keep their mouths shut. If they find a vulnerability in a power grid or a hospital or a bank, they won't report it.
Because the risk of the state turning on them is just too high.
Precisely. If the state treats the people who find the vulnerabilities like monsters, the researchers will stop reporting the flaws. The state effectively blinds itself. It chooses reputation shielding and the illusion of swift justice over actual security. And in doing so, it alienates the exact workforce that is uniquely capable of defending the national infrastructure.
Which brings us perfectly full circle back to the BEPRIME case. You can draw a direct causal line from that prison cell in Uruguay to the total collapse of BEPRIME's legal strategy in 2026. Alberto took this profound personal injustice, this massive trauma of being silenced and imprisoned by a technologically illiterate system, and he didn't just survive it, he forged it into a weapon.
This is the exact definition of post-traumatic growth. He realized through agonizing personal experience that institutions will always use their power to silence the truth if that truth threatens their administrative reputation.
So, when BEPRIME tried to use the Mexican legal system to bully journalists and independent researchers in 2026, Alberto recognized the exact same playbook that had been used to destroy his life a decade earlier. He knew exactly how the machine worked, and he knew exactly how to break it. He used his large public platform, he leveraged the international credibility he had gained from his highly publicized appearance on the Darknet Diaries podcast, and he used his lived trauma to become the shield for others. He became the digital knight because he knew what happened when there wasn't one.
He proved empirically that a single individual, armed with forensic truth and a deep understanding of asymmetric pressure, can successfully shatter the protocol of silence.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground today. We've gone from the ironic failure of basic authentication at a cybersecurity firm, through the dark mechanics of corporate legal cover-ups, deep into the systemic dangers of information siloing, and finally to the harrowing origin story of a digital dissident. Let's synthesize this. Why does this deep dive matter to the digital life of the person listening right now?
It matters fundamentally because the state and massive corporate institutions are heavily relying on the public's technical illiteracy to maintain their power. They're relying on you not understanding how Meraki panels work, or what an IOC is, or how the security gap functions. The protocol of silence only works if the public accepts the official, minimized narrative without question.
Exactly. They need you to look at the bank vault and not ask about the sticky note on the manager's desk. But armed with the intelligence from the frameworks we've discussed today, you now have a learner's toolkit to spot this institutional secretism in the wild. You know what to look for.
Yes. The next time a major company or a government agency issues a press release about a data issue, scrutinize the language carefully. Are they using words like glitch, informatic incident, or temporary instability? That is the first pillar. Narrative minimization. They're actively trying to avoid legally actionable words like breach, data exfiltration, or ransomware.
And watch the timeline of events. Did the organization proactively warn you? Or did they only admit to the hack after a third party, like a hacker group posting a ransom demand, or a security researcher hosting an X space forced their hand? If they waited until it was public, that's delayed disclosure. If you see these red flags, you know the institution is practicing secretism, and you must assume your personal data is at far greater risk than they are currently admitting.
The ultimate goal of analyzing these frameworks is to force a paradigm shift in accountability. The intelligence reports explicitly call for an end to the feudal model of IT security. In a feudal model, you, the citizen or the client, are treated as a digital serf. You are expected to blindly trust opaque masters who hide their failures behind massive castle walls and legal departments.
We have to move toward absolute, verifiable accountability. The sources repeatedly point to the Latvian GDPR model as the current gold standard. In that model, transparency is not a PR choice. It is mandated by law. You have 72 hours to report a breach. Silence is legally removed as an option.
Radical transparency must be viewed not as a vulnerability, but as a mandatory prerequisite for digital sovereignty. Institutions must be forced to acknowledge that their primary duty is the protection of citizen and client data, not the preservation of their own image.
Thank you. Your forensic analysis of these frameworks has been incredibly illuminating today. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something from the very edge of the intelligence reports we reviewed today that genuinely kept me up last night. We've spent this entire time talking about the battle for radical transparency against human administrators, CEOs, police officers, government officials who hide behind the protocol of silence out of a very human sense of embarrassment, career preservation, or incompetence.
Yes, the human element is the driving force of secretism.
Right. But the sources mention a terrifying new frontier on the horizon, the weaponization of AI and administrative opacity. They note that judges and administrators in places like Colombia, Peru, and Mexico are already beginning to secretly use AI, like ChatGPT, to draft judicial opinions, analyze forensic evidence, and handle sensitive citizen data.
Yeah.
And they're doing this without any public guardrails, logging, or disclosure. Commercial entities are using AI to flood the zone with automated legal threats and undisclosed disinformation.
It is the complete automation of opacity, the removal of the human paper trail.
Exactly. So here's the question you have to ask yourself. If we are already struggling and frequently losing, the battle for transparency against human beings, people who feel shame, who fear bad PR, who can be pressured by organizations like Amnesty International, what happens when those same secretive institutions hand the master keys over to algorithmic black boxes? What happens to the protocol of silence when the system making the decisions, drafting the legal threats, and hiding the breaches has absolutely no concept of public accountability at all?
It's a profound risk. If the combination to the vault is left under the welcome mat, but an AI is the entity writing the incident response report, will it ever possess the ethical imperative to tell us the door is open?
It's a chilling thought. We are entering a new era of digital conflict. Stay curious, demand transparency, and always keep an eye out for the glitches in the matrix. Until next time.